There's an urgency to take on the mission of Christ. So, are you prepared? Welcome to Back to the Bible. Today, Pastor and Bible teacher Bryan Clark helps you understand that you have an important role to play in this mission. After his message, Bryan will join Kara Whitney and Arnie Cole to share some important take-home points. Now let's begin in 1 Peter chapter 4. Here's Bryan Clark.
So verse 7, the end of all things is near. There's kind of this sense of urgency in those words. The background of those words would be that basically from Genesis 3:15 up into Abraham and on through the prophets, there was a promise that one day God would send a Messiah. That one day God himself would take on human flesh in order to provide salvation for sinful men and women. It's the story of Christmas, that at a moment in time, God actually entered into this world as a man, as the God-man. He was rejected, he was reviled, he was maligned, and ultimately crucified for the sins of the world. Now that the Messiah has come, there's nothing else we're waiting for. If you remember the story of Christmas in the Gospel of Luke, when Joseph and Mary brought Jesus to the temple, Simeon said, "My eyes have finally seen thy salvation. I can die in peace." He understood this was what everyone's been waiting for. From the ascension of Jesus to present day, the New Testament refers to this as the last days. Sometimes you hear people say, well, I think we're living in the last days. I know we're living in the last days. The New Testament says from the ascension of Jesus to the return of Christ, these are the last days. What's meant by that is there's nothing else we're waiting for. Jesus may come back today. He may come back tomorrow. It may be 100 years from now. We don't know, but there's nothing else that needs to happen for that to occur. So there's a sense of urgency. There's the realization we can't waste one more day. What's at stake are the eternal souls of the men and women around us. Therefore, knowing Jesus could come back tomorrow, we have work to do. Arm ourselves, get with it. That's in essence what Peter is saying. I think one of the best ways to understand this is if you've ever sold a house. You get the house all spiffied up, and then you live in this state of readiness. You know, you're constantly keeping it clean and tidy. You don't want anything to mess it up because you don't know at any moment the realtor's going to call. By the way, in 15 minutes, I'm bringing someone over. And so you kind of wait in this state of readiness. That's kind of the idea. Jesus could come back today or tomorrow, so there's this sense of readiness, this sense of urgency. I need to be living in light of that. The end of all things is near. Therefore, be of sound judgment, which means right thinking, and sober, which means clear thinking. I need to be thinking rightly. I need to be thinking clearly for the purpose of prayer. Literally, it's plural, for the purpose of prayers, which is this idea that I am living in alignment with the will of God, with the mission that God has given me. So I think rightly, I think clearly, and I live my life each day accordingly. Above all, keep fervent in your love for one another, because love covers a multitude of sins. The second time Peter has told us, part of the result of being born again is a fervent love for one another. Basically, the idea is if we're going to experience the battle out there, then we need to have a place of refuge in here. There needs to be a place where it's safe. There needs to be a place where we heal, where we learn, where we grow, where we're strengthened. We need to get it right in here in order to be effective out there. The idea of love covers a multitude of sins is taken from the Proverbs. It just basically means the church is still made up of humans, and humans are kind of odd, and they can be irritable, and sometimes they even say and do hurtful things. But we need to unite ourselves around a common mission. And to understand, we need to give our lives to something bigger than ourselves. Our culture is basically defined by selfishness, by self-absorption, and by people because of that who are offended by everything. It seems like that's all we do as a culture is we're constantly selfishly offended by everything everyone says or does. The danger is in bringing that mindset into the church, where I'm selfish and I'm self-absorbed and I'm just offended by every little thing. And as long as that's true, we'll never accomplish the mission. The idea that love covers a multitude of sins is the idea that we need to put differences aside. We need to put those little hurts and irritations and struggles aside and say there is a greater mission that we're called to. And for the sake of the eternal souls of the people around us, we need to have our act together and we need to love one another in order to be as effective as possible out there. I think we would all agree that this year has been a very difficult year in our nation. So many natural disasters, so many human disasters, so much chaos and hatred and bloodshed. It's just been a very, very difficult year. But in the midst of these very difficult stories, there have been some amazing human interest, heroic stories of people who have risen to the occasion, set differences aside, and actually risked their own lives in order to help or rescue people they don't even know.
You're listening to Back to the Bible. If you'd like to listen again, visit backtothebible.org. That's backtothebible.org. Now let's return to Bryan Clark and his message from 1 Peter chapter 4.
There's been some amazing stories that kind of renew your sense in the human spirit that it is possible that as a culture we could be different than who we are today. They're just these glimpses. One of the things that's been frustrating is you have none of that among our national leaders. You have seen none of that among our national politicians. Think back when 9/11 happened. Our politicians in Washington gathered on the steps of the Capitol within 24 hours, and together they sang, "God bless America." Think about how much has changed in such a short amount of time. Now, in the midst of these terrible human tragedies, within hours, the politicians are exploiting human tragedy for political gain. Before the facts are even in, I find it utterly disgusting. But this is what we need to learn from that. We need to remind ourselves what that's telling us, that the change will never come from Washington, D.C. It won't. It's going to come in the trenches. It's going to come in the grassroots. It's going to come from the average people in the streets in the community that finally say, we want something different. And at the forefront of that movement should be the people of God. who aren't contributing to the hate, aren't contributing to the anger, aren't contributing to this being offended by every little thing. But rather we choose to roll up our sleeves, to get in the mix and genuinely seek to make a difference. There's a sense of urgency to this. In order for that to happen, it needs to start together as the church, as we love one another here, in order to be effective accomplishing our mission out there. Then Peter just basically kind of defines this love further. Verse 9, be hospitable to one another without complaint. As each one has received a special gift, I prefer a calling, employ it in serving one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. Whoever speaks is to do so as one who is speaking the utterances of God. Whoever serves is to do so as one who is serving by the strength which God supplies, so that in all things God may be glorified through Jesus Christ, to whom belongs the glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. In essence, we've all received a calling. So we need to be faithful to our calling, whether it's up front or whether it's behind the scenes. We need to be faithful to that calling, to the praise and the glory of Jesus Christ. These verses remind us that our mission statement as a church is dead on, to glorify God by seeking to present every person complete in Christ. That's exactly what Peter just said. So Peter is saying we need to arm ourselves, which is a mindset. It's a game face, to realize if we're going to follow Christ. We've wasted enough of our lives pursuing the things that don't matter. Let's not waste one more day, but rather let's choose to rightly represent the message of the gospel, understanding it will come with cost. The people around us won't always understand or appreciate the righteous path that we have chosen. But there's a sense of urgency to this. The people that you work with, the people that you live next door to, the people that you go to school with, every person in our community will one day stand before a holy God in judgment. People are free to believe what they want. And if people want to believe all roads eventually lead to God, they're free to believe that. But at the end of the story, there's only one opinion that matters, and that is the opinion of God. And God has been perfectly clear that there is no way to God except through the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. Therefore, we have a responsibility to be faithful stewards of the message. Jesus may come back tomorrow. There's a sense of urgency to this. So there's lots of ways, I suppose, that we could illustrate this. But I'm going to illustrate it this way. I would say that we as a church do well with this. I do think that we love one another. I do think that love covers a multitude of sins. I do think, generally speaking, we are united around a common mission. I think this is something we take seriously, and I think we take seriously our call to represent that message out into the streets and the neighborhoods and the community. In light of that, stop and think about it. Right now, this very day, there's people we know, people we work with, people living next door, people we go to school with, who today are lost in their misery. They are empty. They are desperate. They're trying everything this world has to offer to somehow satisfy the emptiness within. They're trying to figure out some way to deal with the restlessness inside of them, but now they're getting more desperate because they're starting to wonder if anything will ultimately ever satisfy. They may put on a happy face at work or school and in public, but at night, when their lights are out and nobody's around, they are empty, they are desperate, and they are wondering, is there really a reason to live one more day? But as a result of people taking this mission seriously and choosing to live on mission, some of those people who right now, today, are empty and desperate, 1 year from now, their lives will have been radically changed by the power of Jesus. They will know the forgiveness of sin. They will know the removal of their shame and guilt. They will have found what their soul has been longing for. They will have a sense of meaning and purpose and hope. And their lives will have been radically transformed by the power of Jesus. A year from now, some of those in your school, in your neighborhood, in the workplace, in the community, they will be among us. And they will bear testimony that their lives have been radically changed by the power of Jesus. And that will be true because there's many of you that take this mission seriously. And God will use you to be a voice, to proclaim a message that will change someone's life forever, to the praise of the glory of God.
Up next, Bryan Clark joins author Kara Whitney and Back to the Bible CEO Arnie Cole in the studio for some candid conversation about today's message.
Bryan, thank you for reminding us that we're on a mission. This is serious stuff. And for all those people who, like me, who aren't really extroverts, it's pretty amazing how God will help you just take one step at a time, a little bit out of your comfort zone, to be nice to a stranger, get to know your neighbor, turn away from a fight, and really all you have to do is keep your eyes focused on Jesus and take that first step.
Yeah, so as a fellow introvert, I'm not a real social butterfly. I know it's a big shocker.
I've never noticed that.
Right, but I love people. Introverts love people. So I think moving away from the idea that I need to corner someone and lay it on them, which paralyzes most people so they don't take a first step, it's really helpful for me to think I want to pursue people, to value people, to listen to them, to encourage them. And most of the time, it ends up in meaningful and often spiritual conversations if you start the conversation correctly. So for people that don't do this, the first step is just be nice. Just say hello, just offer a word of encouragement, and let the conversation go from there.
When I give the gospel to everybody, this is how I start it. How are you? People will tell you how they were doing, and they really appreciate it.
In a culture where no one listens,
Yeah.
if we listen,
It's
people
huge.
are so hungry for that.
Yeah, and then they say something, and then I ask a question about what they said, and you would be amazed how almost every time it will end up in a spiritual conversation.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah. Verse 7 says, "The end of all things is near." I almost want to say that like Charlton Heston or something, because if you take it out of context, it sounds like end times talk or like a disaster movie or something, tagline.
Yeah, so those kind of comments sell a lot of books and attract a lot of attention. But Peter's referring to the last days, which started with basically the ascension of Christ and will be completed at the return of Christ. So this is just a critical time. The Savior has come, and we are stewards of the message, and we have a job to do. So there's an urgency to it. It's kind of like if it's a football game, it's the fourth quarter, and we need to play accordingly.
And Bryan, in verse 9, Peter talks about the importance of hospitality. And here again, for us introverts, we have got the excuse, we're very busy people. It does require some planning, but more importantly, it's a matter of just opening your home and maybe even sharing a meal with somebody can really make a positive impact on relationship.
Yeah, so I think it's helpful to understand cultural differences. So hospitality in a first century world wasn't having your neighbor over for supper. They didn't have motels, they didn't have restaurants. The few inns were not safe places. So it's more like helping people as Christians moved and traveled, invite them in, make sure their needs are met, feed them, take care of them. So in some ways that's helpful for people that maybe their strengths aren't to have someone in their home and serve them a nice dinner. It's how do you serve them? How do you meet their needs? How do you take care of them? And there's just plenty of ways to help out, people thinking through their hobbies, their skills, the opportunities. But in a very busy online culture, face-to-face moments where we slow down, they're very important.
Also in verse 9, it tells us to be faithful to our calling. That's actually a really pretty picture of the church. It values all of us, and it reminds us that we all need to work together to build God's kingdom.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think about our congregation, and I say this to them often. We penetrate every area of the city, every corner, everything that goes on. And so it's an opportunity for the light of Jesus to shine everywhere in our community if everyone's living on mission. So it's really important, I think, for people to remember the highest calling is not to be a missionary or preacher. The highest calling is your calling. There's no calling that's more than, there's no calling that's less than. So people are called to be farmers and ranchers and electricians and plumbers and doctors and lawyers and comedians and preachers. It's just each of us needs to be faithful to our calling. That's how we penetrate the culture with the light of the gospel.
One thing I wanted to add about hospitality that I have seen, especially being an introvert, we've opened our barn up to the community, and at first started out to be where we're sharing God's gift of horses, wanted to help my wife. We lost our son to a drug overdose. But over the years, this opening up to hospitality has really been the biggest blessing to me, to see how you get these relationships with people that don't know Jesus, and you get to know them over the years, and they get to know you. And it's a tremendous and powerful tool, just doing something as simple as being welcoming to people who you normally wouldn't welcome into your home or barn in our case.
Yeah, I think it's stewarding what you have. We have a pond. We let lots of people come fish, and lots of conversations come out of that.
You're listening to Back to the Bible. If you'd like to listen again, visit backtothebible.org. That's backtothebible.org.